So I'd like to welcome Kennedy Osuka to the stage from the University of York, and he will be talking about assessing the effects of fishing on multiple species in the Celtic Seas.
So I'm Kennedy Osuka. I am a research associate with University of York. It's good that Sam was before me. He talked about the demand side. Now let's look at modeling of the ecosystem and what we have been able to do so far. So my talk will be centering around modeling using Mizer R-Package in order to get some insights on sustainable management. So the purpose of this talk is actually to show you a tool that can be applied to really understand the effects of management measures. And in this case, I seek to gather more stakeholder-informed management scenarios, which we can conduct for this particular project. So this is my outline. First and foremost, just to set the scene about the UK fisheries and landings and how multi-species modeling using Mizer can be applied to answer several questions and highlight some results around size spectra, effort scenarios, and finally give a summary on the next steps. So starting us off, if we look at the UK fisheries, it's normally managed or monitored using these icy sub-areas. And these are areas that are considered to be unique or in their own way to have almost similar stocks. And that is the basis which scientists and managers uses to manage their stocks. And in our case, we've been working in the Celtic Sea, which is the area shown. So this area down here, so we've been working in that area, trying to understand the ecosystem there. And this area is quite a productive system, having generated about 222 million pounds in 2021. So it's quite a relevant fisheries and contributes about 25% of UK's value in terms of the fisheries. So quite an important area. And if you look at the landings for this particular, for the UK in relative to the Celtic Sea, we find that Celtic Sea sub-areas really are important in terms of their contribution to the live landings in the UK. And they're among the highly productive ones, contributing significantly to the landings in the UK. In terms of the species groups in the Celtic Sea, we have, it's mainly dominated by the shellfish, followed by the pelagics, and lastly, the demersals. And then across the different sub-areas, we see that there's variation in the Celtic Sea species group, such that there are some sub-areas like 7C, which is dominated by the pelagics, whereas others like 7E, which is dominated by the shellfish. So quite a diverse type of species groups across the sub-areas. In terms of the species groups, they also do vary, but mainly we have the demersal taking the lion's share of the species in the area. This followed by the shellfish, and then lastly, the pelagics. Among these groups, the blue whiting is the most dominant pelagic species. And then among the demersal, we have the monks, and the scallops quite make a significant contribution for the shellfish. Now, in terms of management measures that have been happening in this area, first and foremost, we have quotas. These are things that total allowable catch for different vessels. And there are about 29 species associated with quotas for the demersal, 1 species for the shellfish, the nephros, and then 9 species for the pelagic. And so this, associated with these quotas, the fishermen are required to have the landing obligation in order to prevent discards. Another important thing is about the species protection. There is a sole recovery zone whereby fishing vessels are restricted in terms of their effort controls for vessels that are of 10 meters or over. So that's quite an important management measure in this particular area. There's also the gear selectivity measures around the cod and size, with different species having different selectivity parameters. And lastly, there's fisheries management plans for different species. For example, the herring, for the pelagic, and then other demersal species also need to have fisheries management plans. So when you look at the landings for the different gears, we can characterize the Celtic Sea to be a trawl-based fishery, but there is also contribution of other gears, particularly the dredge, cotton traps, hand lines, drift net, and fixed nets. So having looked at all these fisheries, we can characterize the Celtic Sea to be a multi-species, multi-gear, multi-fleet. And these particular characteristics really calls for this multi-modeling, multi-species modeling. And luckily enough, we do have a package in the R that's called Mizer that can be used to really model all these different things that are associated with the Celtic Sea. The Mizer package really allows the inclusion of different species and different fishing mortality, as well as different fishing gears. In any case you're interested, you can scan this and it will take you to a page where it explains different parameters or different components of the Mizer package. As I've mentioned, it's a size-based approach in which it captures the complex interaction of different species in order to deduce this population dynamics in the system. And how does the size-based modeling work? So if you look at the relationship between the density estimates and the size, we have this negative relationship such that we have very small things in nature, like the zooplankton, the phytoplanktons. They make quite a big contribution in the ecosystem. And in such a case, they form what we call the resource spectrum. And this resource spectrum is important for small fish, particularly the larvae. And once the larvae feeds on that resource, they do grow to become subadults and later on grow to become mature fish. And as they continue to grow, they also change their diet by feeding on other fish. And that in its own way leads to the growth and to become a mature fish. In essence, therefore, if a fish reaches maturity, they now reallocate most of its energy towards reproduction and stop growing. So in that case, as they reproduce, that reproduction feeds into the, would go and feed into the resource. And that's an important part, because what that means is that we are having a dynamic spectrum which would change depending on the overriding factor, whether it's fishing, whether it's feeding, and whether it's availability of prey in the system. So what Mizer does is it helps model the ecosystem, first of all, by starting at the physiological rates of individual species, and therefore, and also look at the predation preference in order to deduce the population dynamics in the system. So we've been able to use Mizer to model 17 species, and this is what we've been able to get. So you can see the green line is the resource spectrum. We have the graph showing the relationship between the biomass density and the size, and the different lines. In this case, these ones are the different species that we've been able to model, the 17 species. One thing that you can see, there's this bump here. That bump is because the species, there's that increase in abundance that we see around that particular place is because of the increase in shifting from reproduction now, shifting from growth and into reproduction. And that helps, really is an important characteristic about the Mizer species spectrum graphs. So in terms of what influences the different shapes is that the food intake would influence the these different shapes, as well as the growth rates and also the mortality, and how the species will be able to reallocate energy towards reproduction. So we've been able to build a model, first of all, by following a number of steps. And the key steps in order to build a model is, first of all, to select the species. Second is to collect the important parameters and then conduct the modeling using the Mizer. So we've started with 17 species, as I mentioned, 5 of which were pelagic and 12 were demersal. And this was done by collecting variables from various sources, key ones being fish-based, ICES working group reports, and stomach data that were shared through CIFAS. Now, to the interesting bit is that you are able to do some modeling and also come up with scenarios in which you are able now to understand the system. In this case, we did a scenario whereby we are increasing the effort on fishing of our most dominant species, in this case, the blue whiting, and also reducing the effort on one species, sole, since we have a sole recovery area to reduce effort. So if we do this scenario together, you would expect maybe there'll be an influence on the target species in which you are doing the management. But that's not always the case. Let's just see. If you look at the impact on the biomass, since we reduced the effort on the sole, its biomass in nature increases up to around 25% at year 20. But then for the other species, for blue whiting, its biomass reduces. But then what is important is what's happening for the other species. So the other species are also being influenced by that particular management measure. And that's key in terms of understanding multi-species fisheries. The same happens to the yield. If you look at the yield, in as much as we were just focusing on 2 species, yes, we can see changes on them, but then there's also some other changes happening in the other species. So in terms of the next steps, first of all, you want to gather more stakeholder-informed scenarios through CIFAS, Waitrose, and Seafish, and then also utilize Mizer flexibility to really add other important species based on the fisheries management plans. So in terms of the summary, we can say that the Celtic Seas is a multi-species fishery, a very complex and diverse fishery. And second is that by utilizing Mizer, you're able to understand this complex relationship. And lastly, it has the flexibility of undertaking scenarios which will enable you understand how that will impact the yield and the biomass of fish. With that, thank you for your attention.
Thank you to Kennedy. Swiftly moving on.